need to have some really deep soul searching about who they want deciding their fate in the future after this next election. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President from Illinois, Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, first let me thank my colleague from Iowa, Senator Harkin, for the clarity of his statement, for his sincerity, and most importantly, for his leadership. We have the Affordable Health Care Act because of Tom Harkin and Chris Dodd and Barbara Mikulski and others who worked hard to make sure that it was here to help families all across America, particularly those in a low-income situation. And like Senator Harkin, I was stunned this morning when the Republican Senate leader came to the floor and said the first thing we want to do is to repeal all of this health care and preventive care that will be available across America, including the provisions that go into effect tomorrow, protecting 47 million of our women and family members across the United States, 2 million in Illinois, I might add, that will be helped by this. And they insist on bringing up on the pending bill on the floor this amendment to basically remove the protection for these women that is built into affordable health care. But I have to say to Senator Harkin, we can't be too surprised at this. Does the Senator remember the very first amendment the Republicans offered on the transportation bill, a bill that we wanted to pass to build highways and airports? Remember what Senator Blunt, the Republican from Missouri, offered as the first Republican amendment to the transportation bill? It was on family planning. Family planning and transportation, I guess some late-night comedians can make a connection here, but I don't get it. And now we have pending the cybersecurity bill to protect America from a cyber attack which could literally cost American lives, something we're told is the #1 defense threat to America. And Senator McConnell comes to the floor on behalf of the Senate Republicans and says, this bill will not go forward unless we can offer amendment to repeal the Health Care Reform Act, repeal the protections that are in there for families and women across America. It is stunning that no matter what issue we go to, the Republican senators return to this issue of denying health care coverage and denying protection and preventive care to our families. But in a way, Senator, you touched on it. It's pretty easy for a senator to come to the floor and talk about somebody else's health care, because you and I know, and Senator McConnell knows, the health care we have as members of the United States Senate. American families would die for the health care we have. We have the best health care insurance in the world, and we have it in a government-administered plan that protects every senator and their family. We're lucky. We're in the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. And I believe that people across America should have the same opportunity for the same type of health care. I'm still waiting, Senator Harkin, for the first Republican senator who gets up on the floor and denounces government-administered health care to walk to the well and say, as a proof of my sincerity, I am going to abandon my own health insurance as a senator. Not one has done it. Not a single one. So, for the senators who come to the floor, their wives will still be protected by our health insurance. Their daughters will still be protected. The question we have to ask is, the protection we have as senators for our families, should it be available to all across America? That's what this is about. Tomorrow is a launch of an amazing development in health care protection for our families. I applaud it. To think, my wife and I are still celebrating. Our daughter gave birth to twins in November. We have twin grandchildren. They're 8 months old. We couldn't be happier. And they got through just great, through a pregnancy and where she was cared for and did just great. And we're so proud of our daughter and son-in-law and the family. And I think about a provision that's going to go into effect tomorrow. I'm sure the senator from Iowa knows it. Pregnant women in danger of gestational diabetes that could threaten their lives or the lives of the babies they're carrying will now have preventive screening to protect them. Don't come to the floor and tell me you're pro-life and pro-family and oppose that, because if you want a healthy mom and a healthy baby, This screening that starts tomorrow for millions of American women is going to be a step forward, a positive step toward uneventful births and healthy babies. Think about the care and screening for cancer and for all of the problems that women face. I see Senator Murray on the floor here. She has been an extraordinary leader on this issue, and I want to yield the floor to her in just a moment. But I want to close by saying this. All those who were on this campaign to repeal Obamacare, that was their slur on it. We accept it. It is health care under President Obama. I was proud to vote for it. One of the most important votes I ever cast as a member of the House or Senate. Those who want to repeal this so-called Obamacare, as Senator McConnell called for again today on behalf of the Republicans, would repeal a few basic things we shouldn't forget. Every family in America with a child with a pre-existing condition, think of asthma, diabetes, a history of cancer. Under our law, they cannot be denied health insurance coverage. We protect those kids. We protect their families. The Senate Republicans want to repeal it. Seniors across America who are paying for prescription drugs and going into their savings to fill the donut hole each year are getting a helping hand from the Affordable Health Care Act. The Senate Republicans want to repeal it. Families across America with kids fresh out of college looking for jobs that can't find them or have a job without good health care can still be covered under their parents' policy until the young person reaches the age of 26. That's what the Affordable Health Care Act does. The Senate Republicans want to repeal it. And tomorrow, when 47 million Americans, 47 million women in America now have preventive screening so that they can be healthy on an affordable basis and be mothers giving birth to healthy babies, that is in this new law, and the Senate Republicans want to repeal it. This isn't just a war against the pill. This isn't just a war against family planning. It is literally a war against women. And the statements of the Senate Republican leader on the floor today are proof positive that they have one focus, and that is to take away these protections which we build into the law. I'm happy to yield the floor to our leader on this issue, my colleague from Washington, Senator Murray.
Senator from Washington.
Would the Senator yield just for request?
I will.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I ask the following request I make appear prior to my previous remarks on the floor. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Oliver O'Connor and Kevin Burgess of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's session.
Mr.
Without
President.
objection. Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today very excited about the great progress America is going to make tomorrow, August 1st, for women across this country, and to share the outrage that I just heard from the senator from Illinois and others, that before those even go into effect tomorrow, on the eve of this great opportunity for so many women, the Republican leaders come to the floor and says, no, we want to repeal it, First Amendment, on an issue not related at all, cybersecurity, but to take those away before they even begin. Because, Mr. President, it is an exciting moment for women in this country, because 2 years ago, health insurance companies could deny women care due to so-called pre-existing conditions like pregnancy or being a victim of domestic violence. Denied. 2 years ago, women were permitted to be legally discriminated against when it came to insurance premiums, and were often paying more for coverage than their male counterparts. 2 years ago, women did not have access to the full range of recommended preventive care, like mammograms or prenatal screenings that the senator from Illinois talked about. 2 years ago, insurance companies had all the leverage. 2 years ago, too often, women paid the price. That is why I'm so proud today to come to the floor with so many of our colleagues to highlight just how far we have come for women in the past 2 years, and the new ways that women will benefit from health care reform starting tomorrow, August 1st. You know, since the Affordable Care Act became the law of the land, women have now been treated more fairly when it comes to health care costs and options. Deductibles and other expenses have been capped, so a health care crisis won't cause a family to lose their home or their life savings. Women can use the health care exchanges to pick quality plans that work for themselves and their families. And if they change jobs or have to move, which so many people have to do today, they can keep their coverage. And now, starting tomorrow, August 1st, Additional types of maternity care are going to be covered. Women will be armed with the proper tools and resources in order to take the right steps to have a healthy pregnancy. Starting tomorrow, women will have access to domestic partner violence screening and counseling, as well as screening for sexually transmitted infections. And starting tomorrow, women will finally have access to affordable birth control so we can lower rates in maternal and infant mortality and reduce the risk of ovarian cancer and improve overall health outcomes and encourage far fewer unintended pregnancies and abortions. That is a goal that we all share. Mr. President, I also want to note the affordable contraceptive policy we put in place preserves the rights of all Americans while also protecting the rights of millions of Americans who do use contraceptives, who believe that family planning is the right choice for them, and who don't deserve to have politics or ideology prevent them from getting the coverage that they deserve and want. Mr. President, starting tomorrow, women are now fully in charge of their health care, not an insurance company. That's why I feel so strongly that we cannot go back to the way things were. While we can never stop working, of course, to make improvements, which we all know are important, we owe it to the women of America to make progress and not allow the clock to be rolled back on their health care needs. You know, Mr. President, despite the recent Supreme Court decision upholding this law, I know some of our Republican colleagues are furiously working to undo all the gains that we have made in health care reform for women and families. We heard the minority leader this morning come to the floor and wants to offer an amendment on the next bill that's now coming up on cybersecurity to repeal all of these important protections for women that women are taking advantage of today, and certainly something we all should want for our families and our daughters and for the women in this country. I know, apparently, that they think repealing the entire health care law is a political winner for them, but the truth is, Mr. President, this law is a winner for women and for men and for children and for our health care system overall. So I'm proud to be out here with my colleagues today who are committed to making sure the benefits of this law do not get taken away from the women of America, because politics and ideology should not matter when it comes to making sure women across America get the care they need at a cost that they can afford. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Good morning.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, as the Senate now turns its attention to the pending legislation whose aim is to enhance our nation's cyber defenses, I'd like to take a few moments to review where we are, because the bill we now have on the floor, I think, brings us closer than ever to an agreement on a way to better defend our country, our prosperity, our security against what is emerging as the most significant threat we face today. Bigger than conventional attack by a foreign enemy, bigger even than Islamist terrorism, a threat that is very different than anything we faced before, and so probably hard for most Americans to conceptualize, but trust me, it's here. And that's why it's so important that I think we've come closer than ever to an agreement, but we're not there yet. And I've come to the floor to say to my colleagues that those of us who sponsor the pending legislation, Senators Feinstein, Rockefeller, Collins, and I, are eager to continue to work with our colleagues toward a broad bipartisan solution to this national security, urgent national security threat crisis. Obviously, to do that, we've got to begin processing amendments, and they've got to be what the majority leader has said, germane or relevant. The majority leader said we'll have an open amendment process, and I thank him for that. No filling of the tree here. But the amendments have got to be germane or relevant. We're dealing with a national security crisis, unlike any we've faced before. A broad bipartisan group of us met with the leaders of our cyber defense agencies yesterday. Not political people, not partisan people, and they urgently appeal to us to pass this legislation in this session of Congress. It gives them authority to protect us that they don't have now. And frankly, they worry that without that authority to share information with the private sector, for the private sector to share cyber threat information with each other without fear of liability, for the government to have the ability to create some standards for the private owners of cyberspace, and then give them the voluntary option to abide by those standards, that all of those add-ons, all of those realities that will be created by passage of this bill are desperately needed now. The fact is they were needed yesterday. They were needed last year. And that's why I'm so disheartened to hear this morning that our friends in the Republican caucus are talking about introducing an amendment to this bill that will repeal Obamacare, as they call it. It's just not, there's a day for that, but it's not this week on this bill. Frankly, I feel the same way about some of the gun control amendments that have been submitted by members of the Democratic caucus. Those amendments deserve debate at some point, but not this week on this bill. We can get this bill done and protect our security. Nobody believes that we're going to repeal Obamacare this week or that we're going to adopt gun control legislation. Those are sort of making a statement. They're sending a political message, and they'll get in the way of us protecting our national security. So I appeal to my colleagues on both sides. Pull back these irrelevant amendments. Let's have a full and open debate on cybersecurity, and let's get it done this week. There are already more than 70 amendments filed that are germane or relevant. I wonder if I might ask my friend from Kansas if I could have 2 more minutes. I thank the
With
chair,
no objection?
and I thank the senator from Kansas. Already 70 amendments filed, so we don't have time to sit here staring at each other while we could be working through them. The truth is we have a number of amendments we're ready to take votes on, but of course we need cooperation from both sides in order to nail down that agreement with the consent that's required. But I want to, before I yield the floor, underscore that while there are important issues we still need to work through this week, the reality is that because senators on all sides have been willing to compromise, we have a golden opportunity to prove that we can work together when it counts the most, which is in defense of our security and prosperity. Leading sponsors of the pending bill, leading sponsors of the leading opposition bill, Secure IT, and leaders of the peacemakers in between, led by Senators Kyle and Whitehouse, have been meeting for the last week and making progress. And I would say that what was once a wide chasm separating us is now a narrow ridge which we can bridge, and I firmly believe we will, with good faith on all sides, and a willingness to compromise. You can really get 100% of what you want in a democratic small d legislature like ours. But if each side can get 75 or 80%, and we can begin to fix a problem and close the vulnerabilities that exist in our cyber infrastructure this week, we will have done exactly what the American people want us to do. That's my appeal to my colleagues. With that, Mr. President, I thank the chair and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I want to thank my distinguished friend and colleague, Senator Lieberman, for his leadership and in urging members of Congress to bring amendments down that are germane on a very serious national security issue. So I thank him for his comments and his leadership again. I rise today on a different subject, but maybe the same kind of thing. It's to recognize a distinguished group of World War II veterans from Kansas who are now visiting their nation's capital as of today, this week, as part of the honor flight Network. The Honor Flight Network is an organization with a main mission to give veterans the opportunity to visit their memorials on the National Mall free of cost to the veteran. The veterans who participate are many times unsung heroes in World War II, and in many cases their remembrances and their stories are shared for the first time, become public for the first time for families and hometowns. In many cases, young people travel with these veterans, hear the stories, put the stories of these famous battles that protected our country in their local newspapers and in their school newspapers. It's history. It's history shared, lessons learned, and certainly renewed thanks to the greatest generation. Many of these veterans are in their 80s and 90s. There are fewer than 20,000 World War II veterans in Kansas. And as time marches on, that number only decreases. Nationwide, the VA estimates that approximately 740 members of the greatest generation pass each day. So I am especially pleased that this Tuesday a group of 28 will fly in to our nation's capital from Kansas to see their World War II memorial and other memorials and allow us the privilege to pay homage to their heroism. With 5 regional hubs in Kansas, there's a steady stream of veteran groups making their way to our nation's capital. The leaders of these groups include Brian Spencer and Bill Patterson, leading the Honor Flight Kansas Student Edition from Linden, Kansas. Adrienne McDaniel and Peggy Hill, who lead the Jackson Heights Honor Flight. Beverly Mortimer and Denise Sear head up the North Central Kansas Honor Flight out of Concordia, Kansas. Mike Castle, Jeff True guide the Southern Coffee County High School Honor Flight out of Leroy, Kansas. And finally, the leaders of this group coming in on Tuesday are Mike Van Campen and Lowell Downing. These hub leaders and the many volunteers deserve our recognition for hours of work, organization, and fundraising that goes into planning for these trips. So thank you for what you do to these folks and for setting such a fine example in remembering and honoring the sacrifices made by those who stood in defense of our country in World War II. And Kansans and all Americans should know that this program, and as a matter of fact, the World War II Memorial itself, would not even exist without our former Senate Majority Leader, the senior senator from Kansas, and a World War II veteran himself, Bob Dole. Bob is instrumental in bringing the World War II Memorial to the National Mall, and even now, Bob meets personally with honor flight groups who make their way out to see their memorial. When veterans learn that Bob Dole is at the World War II Memorial, there is a crush of veterans, like a flock of chickens going to the mother hen. I'm not sure Bob Dole is going to appreciate that allegory, but at least I think it indicates that everybody comes to hear him and to thank him for his efforts. Finally, Mr. President, I'd like to recognize each member of this honor flight trip from Kansas visiting their memorial and ask unanimous consent that their name appear in the congressional record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum code be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I know under the order this hour is reserved for members of the Republican caucus. Though I am an independent, I don't qualify exactly under the terms of the agreement to speak now. But seeing no member of the Republican caucus on the floor, I thought I would take the opportunity to continue to speak about the pending item S-3414, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, and if any of my colleagues arrive, I will yield to them immediately. Before I yielded to Senator Roberts a short while ago, I made a statement that the two sides, if I can put it that way, that is the sponsors of the pending legislation, Senators Collins, Feinstein, Rockefeller, and I, and the sponsors of essentially the alternate approach, a Secure IT Act sponsored by Senators McCain, Chambliss, Hutchison, and others, have been meeting, and that and particularly assisted by the bridge builders here, blessed are the peacemakers, Senators Kyle Whitehouse and others. And we've been making progress. And I said what was once a chasm separating us is now a narrow ridge that we're close to bridging. Let me explain what I mean by that. The sponsors of S-3414, the pending legislation, strongly believe that owners of critical cyber infrastructure, and this is a unique aspect of our free society, thank God. 80 to 85% of critical infrastructure in our country is privately owned, including cyber infrastructure. That's the way it ought to be. But it means when critical cyber infrastructure in a new world becomes a target of cyber attack and cyber theft, that we, the rest of us Americans, represented by the government, have to enter into a partnership with the private sector owners of critical cyber infrastructure so that they will take steps to protect the cyberspace that they own and operate, because if they don't, the whole country's in jeopardy. I mean, if an electric grid is knocked out, the kind of awful experiences we've all had at different times when the power grid has been out in our area of the country will be felt perhaps for weeks and weeks. Think about it. What if the financial cyber system, Wall Street, the systems that handle millions of trillions, really, of transactions over and over again was knocked out? It would have a devastating effect on our economy, let alone the most nightmarish, which is that some enemy breaks into the cyber control system of a dam holding back water and opens the dam and floods surrounding communities with a terrible loss of life. And you could go on with the nightmarish scenarios, but they're out there, and we're vulnerable to them. So The sponsors of 3414 have felt that private sector owners of critical infrastructure should be mandated, that is, only the owners of the most critical infrastructure, mandated to adopt the standards that would be set under our legislation to protect their systems and our country. Sponsors of the Secure IT Act started this debate firmly convinced that the only thing we need to do is to enhance our cybersecurity information sharing between private sector operators and between the government and the private sector. We have a section in our bill that does exactly that, but we feel that's not enough. We feel there also need to be these standards set for the private operators of the electric grid, of the transportation system, of the financial system, et cetera. If both sides had just stuck to our guns, no legislation would be possible. But when it comes to cybersecurity, no legislation, which is to say the status quo, is not only unacceptable, it's dangerous. Some of our, really most of our national security leaders in this country, from the last two administrations, the George W. Bush administration, Barack Obama administration, have warned, as if in a single voice, that we're already facing the equivalent of a digital Pearl Harbor or 9/11 if we don't shore up and defend our exposed cyber flanks. Same is true of the impact of our vulnerability in cyberspace to cyber theft. General Keith Alexander, the head of the Defense Department's Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, made a speech a week or two ago in which he estimated that more than $1 trillion has been stolen over cyberspace from America. He called it the largest transfer of wealth in history. And that results from moving money out of bank accounts that a lot of us never hear about because the banks feel it's embarrassing if we knew, theft of industrial secrets to other countries that then build from those industrial secrets and create the jobs in their countries that our companies wanted to create here. So there's a unified position among national security leaders, apart from which administration they serve, that we need this legislation and we need it urgently. Several of us met with the leaders of the cybersecurity agencies of this administration yesterday. These are non-political people. These are professionals from the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, the FBI, and others. And they warned us again that the cyber systems that are privately owned and that are critical to our nation's security remain terribly vulnerable to attack. They said to us, and I'm paraphrasing, that we need this legislation to respond urgently and effectively to an attack on infrastructure as critical as the electric grid or Wall Street itself. And one of the leaders in our government, uniformed leaders, said that today, to him, is a little bit like 1993 when it comes to cybersecurity, when, as we remember, Al-Qaeda launched a precursor attack on the Twin Towers in New York with a truck bomb that blew up in the parking garage. We all know that there was a loss of life then, but the damage was relatively small. But Al-Qaeda persisted, and of course on 9/11 succeeded in bringing down the two towers of the World Trade Center. This leader of cybersecurity efforts in our government said that our adversaries today in cyberspace are just about where Al-Qaeda was in 1993 when they blew up that truck bomb in the parking garage of the World Trade Center. What I was impressed with yesterday, I'll say parenthetically, Mr. President, is that though there's some controversy out here about who's capable of what in our federal government, and let me speak frankly, some people don't have much respect for the Department of Homeland Security. And I don't understand why, because they do a great job, in my opinion, in so many different areas, including the one that's relevant here, cybersecurity. But it was clear that the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, FBI, working like a team, really like a seamless team 24/7, 365 days a year to leverage each other's capabilities to provide for the common defense. And they all agreed yesterday that we need to pass this legislation to give them the tools they urgently need that they don't have without this legislation to work with one another and the private sector. Mr. President, I want to again give thanks to Senators Kyle and Whitehouse, joined by Senator Mikulski, Blunt, Coons, Graham, Coates, and Blumenthal, who have come together with a compromise proposal after a series of good faith negotiations. And as a result, Senators Collins, Rockefeller, Feinstein, and I have made major and difficult compromises in our original bill in order to move the legislation forward to get something started to protect our cybersecurity. I think we've now got a broad agreement on a bill containing those same cybersecurity standards that were in our original bill that result from a collaborative public-private sector process and negotiation. But now, instead of mandating them, we're going to create incentives for the private sector to opt into them. We're going to use carrots instead of sticks. And we've added some compromises also from the original legislation to guarantee members of the Senate and millions of people out in the country that when we act to share information from the private sector to the government, that we're going to have due regard for the privacy of people's data in cyberspace, personal information, without compromising our national security at all. There are advocates on both sides of both the information sharing provision and the critical cyber standards provision that think we've gone too far, and some think we haven't gone far enough. But while advocates on the outside of the Senate can hold fast to their particular positions, legislators on the inside of the Senate need to take all these deeply held views into account, but ultimately our responsibility is to get something done to protect our security. It's our responsibility to pass a law. We've done that here. And Mr. President, I'd like to first review some of the broad areas of agreement and then outline the differences that remain, because I want my colleagues to understand how much progress has already been made. Sometimes the news stresses the differences between us. Let me start with Title I of the bill, which is the one on critical infrastructure. I think there's a growing broad agreement now that the private sector owners of critical infrastructure should work with the government to develop what somebody yesterday called the best cyber hygiene, or standards of defense that are needed to safeguard their facilities and the rest of us. We've created, in the original bill, we had the Department of Homeland Security playing the singular role for the government. We've broadened that now in response to particularly recommendations from the Kyle Whitehouse group, and we've created a new interagency council we call the National Cybersecurity Council, which will consist of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, the FBI, and the Director of National Intelligence, as well as relevant primary regulators when that sector of cyberstructure is before the Council. What do I mean by that? If they're dealing with the cybersecurity of the financial sector of our government, then on those standards, we would expect the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Treasury Department, for instance, among others, to be seated at the table to come up with an agreement on those standards. We've also agreed that adoption of these practices will be voluntary and that there'll be no duplication of existing regulations or any new regulatory authorities that will be added to law. We've also agreed that incentives need to be created, the carrots that I've talked about, such as liability protection to entice private sector owners to adopt these practices once they have been developed. Totally voluntary. The difference is, but I think if we build this right, they will come. though it's not mandatory, we will set a standard, and private sector operators of critical infrastructure will want to meet that standard because they'll want to act in the national interest and to protect their customers, but also because when they do, they'll receive very valuable immunity from liability in the event of an attack or a theft. And look, I decided that we needed to make the system voluntary in order to get something passed this year. I think it has a really good chance of working as a voluntary system. But if it doesn't and the cyber threat grows as much as I think it will, then some future Congress is going to come along and make it mandatory. So there's been an incentive on both the public and private sector, particularly the private sector, to make this voluntary system work. Mr. President, God forbid, between now and then, there's a major cyber attack against our country. Congress will come flying back and adopt mandatory regulations. And that's not what we want to happen. This is the time for rational, thoughtful discussion and legislation that will begin a process that will go on for years because the cyber threat is not going away. So that's Title I. That's the compromise we offered on Title I, which deals with cyber infrastructure. I go now to Title VII. In between, there's some very good titles, 2 through 6. But the good news is, and maybe I should stress this, seems to be broad bipartisan agreement on those titles. Title VII is the one on information sharing, and there is some disagreement on that. But we've come to agree that private sector companies must be able to share cyber threat information with the government and each other with protections against liability that will incentivize, really allow that sharing. That this sharing must be instantaneous. In other words, to protect, to respond to concerns about private data being shared when a private sector operator of cybersecurity shares information with the government, we're requiring in this bill, the pending legislation, that the first point of contact for cyber sharing and reporting a cyber attack is with a civilian agency, not a military or law enforcement agency or an intelligence agency. A civilian agency like the Department of Homeland Security or some other approved civilian exchange. Some people have worried that if we did that, it would delay the referral of that information to the law enforcement and intelligence and military parts of our government. Almost as if when the information of a cyber attack is sent to the Department of Homeland Security, somebody's going to have to go find the Secretary of Homeland Security to make sure she sees it before it goes to the Department of Defense, FBI. The world we're in is very different from that. And it's been explained to me and others who met with particularly General Alexander, the head of our cyber command of the Department of Defense. Everything travels instantaneously at cyber speed. And that means that according to pre-set programs, a cyber attack, if this bill is passed, will automatically, notification of it will go to the Department of Homeland Security or a civilian exchange, and at the same instant, it will go to the Department of Defense, the FBI, the intelligence community. But when it first goes to that civilian exchange, there'll be software in there to screen out, to prevent the possibility that any personal data, emails, private financial information will not be sent to the law enforcement and defense branches of our government. So in other words, the sharing will have to be instantaneous. That existing information sharing relationships will continue undisturbed, that is, for instance, between a defense contractor and the Defense Department, and that there should be no stovepipes among government agencies. Agencies that need information should have access to it the instant it is provided to the government. I know that some colleagues want more assurance that while a lead civilian agency will serve as the hub for immediate distribution of cyber threat information, it will do so without slowing down DOD and NSA abilities to access and act on that information. And I've just told you that that would be the case. Others want to add further privacy protections. I do want to say in this regard that we've already significantly strengthened the privacy protections thanks to a lot of good negotiation with a group of senators, Senators Franken, Durbin, Coons, Wyden, and others, and a broad range of privacy and civil liberties groups, ranging really quite remarkably from the left to the right and in between, who seem generally pleased with what we've done to protect privacy under our legislation. And here's the good news. The people in charge of cybersecurity in our government say that the privacy protections that we have added in the underlying bill to the information sharing section of this bill will not stop them for a millisecond from receiving the information they need and protecting our national security. So to me, this is the Senate at its best. We're not there. I mean, my dream here, because this is, we're legislating here, not in the midst of some traditional sort of, business regulation, government regulation controversy. We're legislating actually in the midst of a war, because we're already being attacked every day over cyberspace. We've been lucky that it hasn't been a major attack that has actually knocked out part of our cyber infrastructure. But that vulnerability is there. A few months ago, there was a story in the Washington Post about a young man in a country far away that launched an attack against a small utility, I believe it was a water company in Texas, and got into their system and actually had the ability to totally disrupt water supply in that area of Texas. What he did instead, the hacker did instead, and this was nobody with, he just had a computer and was smart. What he did instead was post proof that he had broken into the industrial control system in that small utility in Texas, just to show the vulnerability. In a sense, he might have been bragging that he could do it, but it was also a warning to us. What if the next time that happens, it's a larger utility or a group of smaller utilities around the country, maybe water, maybe electricity, maybe gas, and this time they're not just warning us or showing us our vulnerability, but they're actually going to disrupt the flow of electricity or water to people who depend on it. That's the kind of crisis that we face and why it is so urgent that we deal with this. So let me come back to my dream. My goal here is that as we go on this week, we're able to submit a manager's amendment, but it's not just from the managers, Senators Collins, Rockefeller, Feinstein, and I. We're joined by a much broader group, and we form a broad bipartisan consensus here to protect our country from a terrible danger that is real, urgent, and growing. Mr. President, I always like to, I was thinking about it again in this case, think back at these moments, and say, I don't see anybody else on the floor, I'll indulge myself and go back to a hot July day in Philadelphia over 225 years ago when the United States Senate was created as part of the, I'm glad to say, proud to say, the Connecticut Compromise offered to the Constitutional Convention by two of Connecticut's delegates to that convention, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. It passed by just a single vote, but it helped keep the convention together and to enable our new government, including our Congress, to take shape, because the Connecticut Compromise guaranteed the small states that their interests would be protected, small population states, in the Senate, because every state, no matter how big or small its population, would have 2 senators. And it guaranteed the larger states that they would have a greater say in the House of Representatives, which would be, whose membership would be reflected, as it still is today, by population. Not everyone got everything they wanted that day, but they found a common ground that allowed them to go forward and finish writing our Constitution. And that's the kind of position that we are in today. Shortly after the Connecticut Compromise was adopted at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, as you know, Mr. President, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, the nature of the senatorial trust would allow it to proceed with coolness and wisdom, end of quote. These negotiations on the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, I think, show thus far that we have the ability to put ideological rigidity, partisanship, politics aside when our security is at risk and move beyond gridlock and fulfill our founders' vision of what this body can do when it comes to debating the great challenges of our time with coolness and wisdom, as Madison said. So over the next couple of days, Mr. President, let's debate all the relevant and germane amendments. Let's start voting as soon as we can on them. But then for the good of the country, let's each compromise some, acknowledging no one of us can get everything we want, and we can't afford to insist on everything we want, because if we do, nothing will happen, and our country will remain vulnerable to cyber attack until the next opportunity Congress has, which I would guess will be sometime as next year goes on, to deal with this challenge. We can't wait. We simply cannot wait. So I know we can do this, and I urge my colleagues, therefore, to come to the floor. I urge the leaders, both parties, to agree that the amendments submitted should be germane and relevant, and that we can and will finish our work on this legislation this week. I thank the chair. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.